June 7th is almost here, and there is a way of receiving Holy Communion that empties the Eucharist before your tongue even knows it has been received. How many times have you walked back from the altar to your pew, sat down, closed your eyes hoping to feel something and found only silence? Yes, you received communion, but something inside you stayed closed. The host came in. Christ did not arrive. Saint Teresa of Jesus saw this. She saw it while kneeling in the choir of her convent, watching her sisters return with faces lit up or faces hollow, and she could tell one from the other every single time. And she left the reason in writing with a clarity that, 5 centuries later, almost no one dares to teach anymore. And what she saw, no one will tell you on Sunday from the pulpit, because it touches a place that hurts, that maybe something of yours, something inside you, is shutting down the very gift Christ is trying to place in you at the moment of communion. What if you have received communion 1,000 times, and 99 out of every 100 you did not actually receive what that sacrament held? On June 7, the feast of Corpus Christi, Christ gives himself with a force that is not repeated on any other day of the year. Today you will hear what Saint Teresa of Jesus left in writing about this. Stop for a moment. Write in the comments these words as a prayer of your heart. Lord, teach me how to receive you. Subscribe to this channel. Each week I leave something new here that very few Catholics are hearing. And what you are about to listen to was placed in my hands with you in mind. In the convent of San Jose in Avila, the morning of Corpus Christi in 1569 dawned with a scent of orange blossom that the older sisters would remember for years afterward. Saint Teresa of Jesus had risen before the others as always, and she was in the lower choir, kneeling, waiting for something. She knew something the novices had not yet understood, that there are days on the Church's calendar when God gives himself in a way that is not repeated. Days when heaven leans down over the earth with a different weight, and June 7th, the day of the body of Christ, is one of those days. Not every Sunday carries the same weight. That was one of the first lessons Saint Teresa of Jesus put down in writing once she began recording what she saw in prayer. The Catholic faith teaches the real presence of Christ in every Eucharist, at every Mass, in every consecrated host. That is firm doctrine, defined by the Council of Trent and held without break for 20 centuries of tradition. The presence is always the same. What changes on certain days is the disposition with which Christ offers himself, and the measure of grace the soul can receive if it comes prepared to welcome it. Corpus Christi is one of those days, and this year, June 7th falls precisely on that liturgical solemnity. Why does this particular day carry a different weight? The Church instituted this feast in 1264, when Pope Urban IV, after the Eucharistic miracles of Bolsena and Orvieto, set aside an entire day of the calendar to celebrate the mystery of the body and blood of Christ. A papal bull, a procession, a hymn, a universal solemnity. But the Pope's decree did not create anything that wasn't already there. It only underlined it. It only gave the Christian people a setting in which to understand what was happening every day on every altar, and what was on the verge of being lost to sheer routine. Saint Teresa of Avila understood this with a sensitivity few of her contemporaries reached. In her time, the Corpus Christi processions across Castile were long affairs, with chanting, with flowers tossed down from the balconies, with little altars set up on every street corner of the city. But she saw further. She saw that the moment of greatest power was not in the outward procession. It was in the inward communion. It was in the instant the soul of the faithful drew near to the altar and received that same host. The rest of the year was received without much thought, almost by habit. There is something important here, something that gets lost if you skip over it without stopping. The grace Christ grants on the day of Corpus Christi reaches every soul who receives communion. That is so. The Church teaches it, the mystics confirm it, Catholic doctrine holds it without wavering. But the measure of that grace each soul actually takes in depends on how the soul comes, how it opens, how it welcomes what Christ places in it. And that was what Saint Teresa of Jesus saw that morning in the lower choir of the convent. Sometime later, she wrote a line in The Way of Perfection that her spiritual daughters learned by heart. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus said, "Our good Jesus is as present to us after communion as he was on the cross of Calvary." That statement is not a pious metaphor. It is a theological truth that very few Catholic souls, even among the most devout, manage to taste with any clarity. If Christ is as present after communion as he was on the cross, then on June 7th, when that presence gives itself with the full intensity of the solemnity of the body of Christ, what the soul of the communicant receives is a visit no human encounter can be measured against. A visit Christ pays in his own body, a visit he makes in person without proxies, without symbolic gestures, without stand-ins. And here surfaces the problem Saint Teresa of Jesus saw in her sisters, the same problem that is still the problem of the devout Catholic in the 21st century. The grace arrives, but the soul does not receive it whole. The grace is offered with infinite generosity, but the soul takes only a fraction of what is held out. The grace is fully available this June 7th, but millions of Catholics across the world will receive communion that day as if it were any ordinary Sunday, never knowing that the loss they are about to suffer cannot be made up at another Mass further down the line. That particular grace, the grace of this year's Corpus Christi, passes only once. If it does not enter, it does not enter. And it remains one more memory of a liturgical day that came and went without anyone really realizing what was being offered. There is a question that at this point begins to press on the chest of anyone listening with honesty. If this is so, if there is a way of receiving that empties the Eucharist and another way that lets it enter whole, what is the first mistake? Where does the loss of what Christ offers begin? Saint Teresa of Jesus identified it. She named it. She described it in detail in her writings and in her letters to her spiritual daughters. And that first mistake, in her view, is not what most Catholics suspect. Unconfessed mortal sin does damage, of course it does, though few reach the altar in that state. Obvious distraction she also mentioned, but the truly devastating mistake is more subtle. It is something even the most devout souls who have been receiving communion for decades carry with them without realizing. Something she saw in herself before she saw it in the others. And when she finally understood it, it changed forever the way she came to God's altar. You are in line for communion. The music plays softly in the background. The people ahead of you move slowly forward, and you take your steps along with them. But on the inside, you are already somewhere else. You are thinking about what you have to do once you leave the church, about the meal you left in the oven, about the phone call you still have to make, about what you are going to say to your son or daughter about the decision that has been worrying you for weeks. Your mouth opens to receive the host. Your tongue feels it. Your hand makes the sign of the cross, but your heart, on the inside, had already closed the door before Christ ever stepped in. What I have just described is what Saint Teresa of Jesus called the inner hurry, and it is, in her view, the first and most widespread of the mistakes that empty communion of its deeper effect. I am not talking about hurrying because of the clock. That kind of rush is visible and almost never the problem in a devout person who has already made the effort to get to Mass. I am talking about a different kind of hurry, one that runs underneath, almost imperceptible, and that the soul does not notice because it believes it is being prayerful, while the hurry is quietly dragging it along on the inside. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote about this in The Way of Perfection. with the clarity of a surgeon. In her own words, "But if we never look at him, nor think about whom we are receiving, but go on as if we were carrying a stick in our hand, how can we love him?" The phrase is hers, word for word, and it is worth reading slowly. Walking as if we were carrying a stick in our hand. That was the image she chose. The image of the soul that approaches the altar mechanically, like a stick, without opening the inside, without looking at the one who is coming. That image lands hard because any devout Catholic recognizes themselves in it. It is worth pausing here for a moment because the prayerful listener tends to push back at this point. They think, "But I do not come without thinking. I prepare, I pray before Mass." And many times that is true. The problem is not the lack of prayer beforehand. The problem is in the final stretch, in the seconds between the moment you stand up from your pew and the moment the host touches your tongue. That short walk, those few yards, almost always hold the greatest loss of the Eucharist, because that is where the mind, without the soul ever quite catching it, runs ahead, toward the exit, toward what comes next. And then, while that is happening, Christ arrives. Saint Teresa of Jesus noticed this same movement in herself from her early years. She noticed it as a novice in the Carmel of the Incarnation in Avila. She noticed it even more once she was prioress and foundress. She used to say that the human soul has an astonishing knack for being physically in a holy place and mentally anywhere else. And that knack, that ability to slip ahead or fall behind, is exactly what the Eucharist asks to be put aside, if only for a few minutes. Here is the heart of what she saw, and it is an image worth holding before you for the rest of Corpus Christi. Saint Teresa of Jesus recounted that in deep prayer she had perceived, on several occasions, what happens in the soul of a communicant who is inwardly hurried. The grace reaches the soul. The grace is offered whole, but the soul, being mentally elsewhere, does not stretch out its spiritual hands to receive it. And the grace, which always respects the freedom of the soul, remains at the threshold. It does not force the door. It does not insist. It is offered, it waits a few moments, and if it finds no welcome, it withdraws. The Eucharistic presence remains as long as the sacramental species remain. That is so. But the particular current of grace, the specific stream Christ wanted to pour into that one soul, on this one June 7th, at this one moment, is cut off. This is what spiritual theology has always called the principle of disposition. Catholic grace is not imposed. It is offered. And the free soul decides how much enters. For June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, this principle becomes more urgent than on any other day, because Christ's self-giving on that solemnity is at its fullest. And if the soul arrives within a hurry, what it loses is proportionally greater. It loses a singular grace, unrepeatable, tied to this specific feast on the calendar. There is one more detail Saint Teresa of Jesus insisted on with her spiritual daughters. The inner hurry is not cured by an effort of last-minute concentration. It does not work to tell yourself, "I am going to focus," while walking up to the altar. Forced concentration produces tension, and tension closes the soul even tighter. What is needed is something different. An inner movement, she taught her sisters, one that is made earlier, much earlier in your own pew, before you even stand up to join the communion line, but that comes later. For now, hold on to the image of the stick. The soul that walks up to the altar like a stick carried in the hand, rigid on the outside, hollow within, going through the motion without welcoming the guest. That image is Saint Teresa of Avila looking at you, at me, at any devout Catholic of 2026 who thinks they are receiving communion well because they have not committed mortal sin and because they crossed themselves carefully on their way back to the pew. And there is a question left hanging, a huge question that hurts to answer honestly. If that consecrated host enters a soul that is mentally wandering, what happens to Christ inside that body during the minutes that follow? What does the soul do with what it has just received, with the one it has just received? That question has gone unasked from pulpits for centuries, but Saint Teresa of Avila put it into plain words. What the soul almost always does, the moment it returns to its pew after communion, is begin to ask. It asks for its children, it asks for its health, it asks for that money problem that has kept it awake at night. It asks for the soul of the departed loved one. It asks for the conversion of a distant relative. It asks. And it does so with a good faith that cannot be challenged. It believes this moment is the golden moment, the instant when Christ is closest, and that is why it lays before him every need built up over the past week. And here appears the second mistake Saint Teresa of Jesus identified, a mistake that hurts more because most devout souls commit it convinced they are doing the right thing. The moment of communion, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, is not the ideal moment to ask. It is the moment to give back. It is the moment to surrender. It is the moment to be with the one who has just arrived. She wrote about this in several places, but there is one line from The Way of Perfection that bears repeating. In her own words, His Majesty does not wish to enter a soul that is cramped or fearful, but needs that the soul give itself to Him entirely. The consecrated host you have just received makes your body for a few minutes into a little church, a living tabernacle. And the guest within does not need you to hand him a list of petitions. He needs you to give him room to be. This lands hard because it goes against a very widespread devout instinct. Most Catholics come to the altar with the idea, handed down by habit, that communion is the moment to ask for much. And it makes sense. If Christ is physically present in your chest during those minutes, it seems logical to take advantage and lay before Him every plea. But Saint Teresa of Jesus, who lived those minutes thousands of times and who observed them with the fine attention of an advanced mystic, saw something different. She saw that when the soul arrives with its mental list, what happens inside is that the soul fills itself, with its needs, with its worries. And a soul filled with itself has no room to welcome what Christ brings. Here is an image she used in her letters to her spiritual daughters, the image of the house. If you were going to welcome an important guest into your home, someone you wanted to honor, what would you do? You would clean. You would clear things away. You would take out what is in the way. You would not set the family troubles list down on the table the second they cross the threshold. First you welcome them. First you let them come in. First you feed them and offer them the best of the house. And later, much later if the conversation allows, you mention what is on your mind. That order, that simple protocol of human hospitality is what the soul forgets at the moment of communion. There is a scene from the old Carmel that is worth holding in your mind to understand this well. In the convent of the Incarnation, where Saint Teresa of Jesus spent nearly 30 years before she founded San Jose, there was an older sister whose name the chronicles have not fully preserved, but whose story was passed down orally through generations within the order. This sister came to communion almost every day carrying a different worry: a nephew who was sick, a family lawsuit, another sister who had offended her, a drought in her hometown. And she received communion with all of that piled on her chest, dropping it at Christ's feet the second the host touched her tongue. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who knew her well, spoke to her one day with the plain honesty she reserved for the souls she was forming. She told her in essence that as long as she kept receiving communion that way, Christ would indeed enter her, but He would also leave right away, because He could find nowhere to stay. The house was too full of the tenant herself. That day, the sister wept. And the next day, when she came to communion again, she did something different. She came to the altar empty, not out of carelessness, but by choice. She received the host. she returned to her pew. And during the first few minutes, instead of asking, she simply was. No words, no petitions, no mental offerings. She just stayed, feeling received, feeling kept company, feeling what she herself later described as a sweet weight inside her chest. What that sister experienced that day was, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, the right disposition of the communicant soul. And from then on, her spiritual life changed at the root. Her emotional health, her inner tensions with the other sisters, her patience, all of it was transformed within a few months. Not because she had asked more things of Christ, because she had stopped asking at the very moment she needed to simply be there. It bears saying plainly because it touches a nerve. On June 7th, if you come to the altar with your mental list of petitions, you will miss what Corpus Christi offers in its unique way. You will receive the host, yes, but the effect that host could have had on your life, the specific effect of the feast of the body of Christ, does not enter a soul that is mentally busy drafting requests. This does not mean there is no time to ask. There is plenty of it. There is time to bring to God every need you carry, and that time is the prayer of the day, the rosary, the Mass before communion, the silent prayer in your room. The petitions are not the problem. The moment you choose to make them, that is the problem. And the wrong moment, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, is precisely the most sacred one of the day, the minutes right after receiving communion. And that brings us to the third mistake, the most decisive of the three, the one that closes the cycle of losses and that no confessor has ever explained to you with enough clarity. 15 minutes, maybe 20. That is roughly how long the sacramental species remain dissolving inside the body of the communicant. Those 15 minutes, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, are the richest stretch of the day, and they are also the stretch that almost every Catholic in the world throws away without knowing. Here is the third mistake, the one that closes the cycle of losses. The soul receives communion, returns to its pew, makes the sign of the cross, and within 5 or 6 minutes, sometimes less, it is already thinking about leaving. Mass ends, the final blessing is given, and the communicant stands up, gathers their things, greets the priest at the door, and goes. That exit, that immediate walking out of the church without having stayed with Christ in silence for the minutes he is still physically inside, is what Saint Teresa of Avila identified as the greatest loss of the modern communicant. There is a line worth pinning to memory. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection, in one of the chapters on the prayer of recollection, a line her spiritual daughters learned to repeat before standing up from their pew after communion. In her own words, if when he went about in the world, the mere touch of his robes healed the sick, why should we doubt that he will work miracles being so deep within us? Read it again, slowly. If the mere touch of his robes healed the sick in the first century, what will he not do being inside your very body? That question, asked by an advanced mystic who knew Eucharistic theology better than most of the professional theologians of her time, holds a truth the devout Catholic rarely lets themselves look at directly. During those 15 minutes after communion, you carry inside you the same Christ who in those years healed by the brush of the hem of his cloak. And most communicants, instead of staying in silence so that presence may work, stand up and leave the church. Here is the emotional peak of this moment of June 7th. And it is worth holding before you the image Saint Teresa of Jesus described in her own spiritual writings. She recounted that on certain occasions, after communion, she had seen with the eyes of the soul how Christ, just entered into her body, would stay waiting. He waited for her to speak to him, to gather herself, to give him a few minutes of inner silence. And when she, still young and still learning, was distracted or thinking about other things, she felt a kind of sadness within her chest, a sadness that was not her own. It was Christ's sadness at waiting to be attended to. It was the bewilderment of a guest who has stepped into a house where no one is paying him any mind. That image is hers. And it is an image that any devout Catholic who hears it should keep for the rest of their life, because the Catholic faith teaches that the Eucharistic presence is not only doctrinal, it is real, it is physical, it is personal. And during those 15 minutes after communion, Christ is literally inside you, present with all his divine and human being, waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for you to be there. That is all he asks, that you be there, that you not wander off into some other thought, that you not stand up to greet someone, that you not open your phone, that you not leave the church until that presence has fully dissolved. Those minutes are, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, the most intimate and most sacred moment a human soul can know here in this life. More intimate than any other religious experience, more intimate than the highest visions, than the ecstasies, than the inner consolations. Because in those minutes, Christ is not outside of you, he is inside. And if you stay with him, what unfolds in the soul goes beyond anything that can be put into words. This is the answer to the question that has been left open from the beginning. That question, pressing on your chest you could not quite name, that sense that communion has left you empty, that suspicion that something was not fully happening. The answer is this: Christ was coming in, yes, but you were going out. You were going out to the worries, to the petitions, to the door, to the street. And Christ, too discreet to force your attention, dissolved inside you without having had the time to do what he came to do. On June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, those 15 minutes carry a force the rest of the year does not show with the same intensity. Because that day, the entire church is united in recognizing the body of Christ, and that union multiplies the stream of grace falling on each individual communicant. If you leave during the first 3 minutes, you take 3 minutes of grace with you and leave 12 sitting on the pew behind. If you stay the full 15, you take with you everything that was being offered. This explains why Saint Teresa of Avila, after communion, would not move from the choir until she sensed within that the Eucharistic presence had done its work. Sometimes it was 10 minutes, sometimes 15, sometimes longer. Her sisters would see her kneeling with her hands joined, motionless, making no sound, with her eyes closed. And that stillness was, as she later wrote, the most sacred time of her whole day. The rest of the day, with her duties as prioress and foundress, rested on those 15 minutes. And the most important part of this June 7 is still ahead. Because knowing what mistakes are emptying your communion is not the same as knowing what to do in their place. For that, Saint Teresa of Jesus left a practice. A step-by-step practice you can apply perfectly this very Corpus Christi without having to read 1,000 books or be an advanced mystic. There is an exact moment in every Mass before the moment of communion itself that decides almost entirely what the soul will actually receive when the host touches the tongue. That moment is not the moment of standing up to join the line. It is not even the moment of the consecration. It is one that comes earlier. And Saint Teresa of Jesus taught it to her sisters with an insistence her contemporaries found a little excessive, until they saw the results in their own lives. The moment is this: the 3 or 4 minutes from the time you walk into the church and sit down in your pew until Mass begins. Those minutes, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, are the first step of the practice. And almost every Catholic spends them greeting people, looking around, adjusting their veil, opening the book, or simply waiting. What you need to do in those minutes is the following, and it is worth learning well because it fits in a single sentence. Close your eyes, place your hands in your lap, and ask Christ in silence to prepare your soul to receive him. That is all. 3 sentences, 3 minutes, and it changes the weight of everything that comes afterward in that Mass. It sounds simple because it is, but its simplicity is deceiving because almost no devout Catholic practices this gesture with any regularity. And yet, in the 3 minutes that small inner preparation takes, the soul turns inward, gathers up its scattered thoughts, sets them in place, and is ready for what will unfold later in the Eucharistic celebration. Saint Teresa of Jesus called this movement of the soul recollection. For her, it was not an Eastern meditation technique, nor an optional devotional exercise. It was simply the inner decision to bring together what is scattered, the worries to one side, the distractions to another side, and the center of the soul left open, free, ready. In The Way of Perfection, she devoted 3 whole chapters to explaining how this recollection is done. And the first lesson she gave is that it is done before any important liturgical act, before Mass, before confession, before communion. If you arrive at the sacred moment with your soul still scattered, that moment cannot enter you. Even though you are physically present, spiritually you are still outside. It is worth telling something concrete here, because abstract doctrine matters, but examples stay in the memory longer. Saint Teresa of Avila used to tell in her letters to her spiritual daughters that she herself, before the choral office began, would sit down in her place 3 minutes ahead of the other sisters of the convent. And during those 3 minutes, she did nothing visible. She did not pray aloud. She did not read. She did not move her lips. She only breathed slowly, and on the inside, she said one single thing to Christ: "Prepare my soul for what is coming." That phrase, almost mute, repeated calmly, was for her the gesture that opened everything else in the day. And here is the second part of the right practice, the one that follows the initial recollection in the pew. Once Mass has begun, the crucial moment is the consecration. When the priest lifts up the host and speaks the words of Christ, the bread is changed into the body of Christ. The real presence has come to the altar. And from that instant until the moment you will receive him on your tongue, there is roughly a 10-minute interval. Those 10 minutes are the second ground of preparation, the richest stretch of the whole Mass. What should you do during those 10 minutes? According to Saint Teresa of Jesus, you must look at the altar. Look at it truly. Lift your eyes slowly. Let your gaze rest on the consecrated host the priest has just placed on the white corporal of the altar. Look at it as if it were the first time, and let the soul begin its approach to the altar before your body even moves. She used to say that the soul can walk while the body sits, that motionless legs do not prevent inner movement, that the soul has its own steps, and that the path of the soul toward the altar during those 10 minutes before communion is what decides the way you will receive. If the soul has walked inwardly, has crossed the nave, has reached the altar, has knelt in the presence of Christ, and asked him to open your chest to receive him, then when the body stands up to join the line, everything is already prepared on the inside. The outer line is the continuation of an inner movement that was already underway. That is the first stage of the right practice. And Saint Teresa of Jesus kept insisting that this stage does not require complicated words. It does not require long prayers. It does not require knowing advanced theological doctrine. What it requires is decision, the active decision to not stay on the surface of the rite, but to step inside. Something still hangs in the air here, because preparing the soul beforehand is only the first of 3 steps. You still need to know what to do in the exact second the host touches your tongue, and you still need to know what to do afterward. That is where the difference lies between swallowing and welcoming, between going through the rite and living it, between the communion that empties and the communion that fills. On June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, this first movement of the soul takes on a different size, because that day, the liturgical solemnity multiplies everything that happens inside the communicant. If you reach your pew 3 minutes early and make this small initial recollection, what you receive at communion will be proportionally far greater than on any other Sunday of the year. That is the first rule of Teresian disposition. What is cultivated beforehand is gathered, multiplied within. But the second rule, the one for the very instant of receiving communion, is even more decisive. 1 second. That is the exact length of the right gesture. 1 single second, the second the consecrated host touches your tongue. And on that 1 second hangs almost everything that will unfold in the 15 minutes that follow, and by extension, almost every effect the communion of June 7th will have on your life. Saint Teresa of Jesus described this second with an image that belongs to the deepest book of 16th century Christian mysticism, the interior castle. And it is worth grasping that image well, because it sums up in a single scene what is at stake. She used to say that the human soul is a castle, a great castle, spacious with many mansions, with rooms on various levels joined by invisible corridors, with an innermost center where God Himself has dwelt since the day of baptism. But most souls, in her view, spend their whole lives without ever stepping into that castle. They stay in the outer courtyard. They go through the religious rites at the entrance. They look at the windows from the street. They pray without getting past the front hall. And they die without ever having known the inner rooms where God was waiting for them with infinite patience. That image, applied to the exact moment of communion, gives the following. When the consecrated host touches your tongue, what has just happened is that Christ has entered your castle. Not the entrance, the center. He has settled in the innermost mansion of your soul, the place you almost never reach, where you almost never stop, where you have almost never seen yourself. And now He is there, waiting. The question is this: are you going in too, or are you going to stay at the door? Most Catholics, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, stay at the door. They receive the host, walk back to their pew, make the sign of the cross, and never step into the inner mansion where Christ has just taken His place. It is as if you had a guest waiting for you in the main parlor of your own house, and you stayed at the front door chatting with the neighbors on the street. Here is the difference between swallowing and welcoming. Swallowing is what the body does. Welcoming is what the soul does, and the soul welcomes when, in the exact second the host touches the tongue, it makes a brief and specific inner movement. It steps in. How do you step in? That is the practical question. And Saint Teresa of Jesus left the answer in several places, but the clearest version is in the 6th chapter of the 5th mansions of the interior castle. In substance, she explains that to step in is to stop looking outward and to turn the attention toward the center of your own chest. It is a gesture of consciousness, not of the body. You do not need to place your hands anywhere. You do not need to close your eyes at any moment, though it helps. What you need to do is direct your attention like an inner arrow toward the place where Christ has just settled. And it is worth learning well the phrase you say in that second, because it must be brief, almost instantaneous, almost a sigh of the soul. Saint Teresa of Avila taught her sisters 3 words. Only 3. You are here. That was all. In the second the host came to rest on her tongue, she would say inside, without moving her lips, those 3 words, you are here. The phrase was not a neutral statement. It was a recognition. It was the spiritual equivalent of opening the main door of the castle to the guest who had just walked in and telling him, with no further words, that you knew he was there. You are here. Repeat them in your mind now as you listen to this. You are here. That is the phrase. Those are the 3 words Saint Teresa of Jesus left as the key to the most important second of the entire Mass. They are not a magic invocation. They are a recognition. You recognize the one who has entered. You name him from within. You open your house to him. When the soul speaks those 3 words at the exact instant, what happens inside is that the arrow of attention points toward the center of the castle. The consciousness moves inward. The soul crosses the front hall, passes through the outer rooms, reaches the inner mansion, and sits down with Christ. Physically, nothing visible has happened. you are still in the line or already walking back to your pew. But inwardly, you have just stepped into your own castle after years of living in the outer courtyard. And that, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, is what changes everything. Because from that second on, the 15 minutes that follow carry a completely different weight. Christ is inside, and you are also inside. The soul and the guest are in the same mansion. And what happens between them in that time is what the Catholic faith has always called true communion. Not only receiving the body of Christ, being with Him within yourself, in silence, in mutual presence. On June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, this gesture becomes even more decisive, because the host you will receive that day carries the liturgical concentration of the whole universal Church, celebrating together the mystery of the body of Christ. If you step into the castle at the exact second, what will happen in your interior in the minutes that follow will have a density no other Sunday of the year produces with the same spiritual force. There is still a third step left, the last of the practice, and the most difficult to apply, and also the most fruitful of all. Because it is not enough to step into the castle. You have to stay in it. You have to know what to do exactly once you are inside with Christ. And that is what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught as remaining, the part that is done afterward. And now what? You have done the first two steps. You have reached your pew 3 minutes early and let your soul gather itself. You have walked inwardly toward the altar during the 10 minutes before communion. You have said you are here in the exact second the host touched your tongue. And now you are back in your pew, kneeling with Christ inside your chest. What do you do during the next 10 or 15 minutes? This question, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, is the most decisive of the whole practice of communion, because the first two steps prepare the ground, but it is in this third step that the harvest is gathered. And most Catholics give up precisely here at the moment when they could receive the most. What she taught is the following, and it is worth learning well because it has 3 parts, one after the other. First, do not move. Stay kneeling. Do not pull out the prayer book. Do not start reading psalms. Do not begin long petitionary prayers. The only thing you have to do during the first 3 minutes is to be still, physically and inwardly. Keep your hands joined. Keep your eyes closed or half closed, and let the weight of the guest settle in the center of your chest. Saint Teresa of Avila compared this first stillness to what happens when someone comes home from a long journey and finally steps inside their house. The first thing they need is not to talk. The first thing they need is to sit down, to catch their breath, to look around, to be there. Only after a few minutes of quietness can the conversation begin. If you start talking the second they cross the threshold, you tire them out more. You do not give them time to truly arrive home. Christ has just arrived in your chest. Give Him a few minutes of stillness. Second, when those first 3 minutes have passed and you sense that the soul has settled into its place, then begin to speak to Him, but not with petitions. Speak to Him the way you would speak to a dear friend who has come to visit you. Tell Him what you carry within, not to ask Him to solve it, so that He may hear it. There is an enormous difference between the two, and Saint Teresa of Jesus underlined it in every letter to her spiritual daughters. When you speak to Him to ask, you fill yourself with your troubles. When you speak to Him so that He may hear, you empty yourself. And the emptying of the soul in the presence of Christ is what opens the true fruits of communion. What do you tell Him? Anything that is real. You tell Him you have had a hard week. You tell Him your heart is tired. You tell Him you carry a worry you have not shared with anyone. You tell Him you are afraid. Or you tell Him you are grateful. Or you tell Him you do not know what to say. That counts too. The silence in these minutes is also speech. Christ understands silences better than long and elaborate sentences. Third, and this is what few Catholics know, during the last 5 minutes of this remaining, when you have already been still and have already spoken to Him, there is a movement of the soul, that is the most fruitful of all possible movements. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes it in the 6th mansions. It is called letting yourself be looked at. Letting yourself be looked at means the following: close your eyes, say nothing, ask for nothing, imagine nothing. Simply hold the presence of Christ within your chest and let Him see you, as if you opened yourself fully, without defenses, without masks, without the image you usually present to the world. You let Him see you as you truly are, and for a few minutes, you remain that way, looked upon by God, hiding nothing of what you carry within. This is the moment, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, when the soul receives the deepest healing, because when Christ looks at us without our placing a mask before Him, what He sees, He heals. What He touches with His gaze, He restores. And many souls in those final 5 minutes of Eucharistic recollection have received inner transformations that no other religious act of their life had ever produced. On June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, this letting yourself be looked at carries a special weight, because the entire church on that feast is also exposed before the gaze of Christ. And the gaze that falls on each communicant who remains in that final stillness is a gaze multiplied by the liturgical union of millions of souls asking for the same thing on the same day of the calendar. This is the complete practice. 3 steps, 3 minutes of recollection before Mass, 3 words in the second of communion, and 15 minutes of remaining afterward, divided into stillness, conversation, and letting yourself be looked at by God. It does not require books. It does not require memorized formulas. It does not require being an advanced mystic. The only thing it requires is decision. The decision not to rush out of the church after receiving communion. The decision not to fill those minutes with built-up petitions. The decision to stay in silence with the one who has come to stay with you. If you do this on June 7th, what will happen inside you will carry a weight you have probably never experienced in a single Mass. Because you will be doing, perhaps for the first time in years, what Catholic communion was designed to be from the beginning. But there is still one last thing. The promise Saint Teresa of Jesus left on record in her writings and her letters about what happens in the soul of the communicant when this practice becomes habit. That promise, which is fulfilled with singular force on the day of Corpus Christi, closes everything you have heard today, and it is worth listening to with an open heart because it changes the way you will receive communion for the rest of your life. In chapter 35 of The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus left in writing a promise that few Catholics of the 21st century fully know. A promise that is not fulfilled in a single communion, but in those who hold to the practice for months, for years, for a whole lifetime. That promise is what closes everything you have heard today. And it is worth listening to with an open heart, because it touches the center of what the Catholic Eucharist was designed to do in the human soul from the beginning of Christianity. The promise, in her own words, runs this way. The soul that receives communion with preparation, with recollection, and remains with Christ after receiving Him is gradually transformed without itself realizing how. The transformation is not the kind you see in a mirror. It is the kind you see in the way of bearing what before could not be borne, in the way of forgiving what before seemed impossible to forgive, in the way of having peace where before there was only a knot in the chest. That is what she promised her spiritual daughters. And pay attention to this, because it touches a point most listeners gloss over without grasping. The promise is not an immediate reward. It is something deeper, something that only becomes clear when one has been in the practice for some time. It is worth stopping on one word. The word is gradually. Because most modern Catholics expect communion to produce an immediate and visible effect, a sensation in the moment, an identifiable emotion. And since that sensation almost never comes with the force they expect, the soul gets discouraged and gives up the practice. Saint Teresa of Avila warned precisely against that expectation. She said that the Eucharist works the way rain works on a dry field, not in a day, not in a week, not necessarily with any sound you can hear. It works underneath. It works slowly. It always works. And a year later, the field that seemed barren is bearing fruit, without the farmer ever quite understanding how it happened. That is the rhythm of the Eucharist. That is the rhythm of the transformation Saint Teresa of Jesus taught as the true effect of the sacrament. Slow on the outside, deep within, irreversible at the end. Here is the heart of the promise, and it is worth fixing in your memory for the months ahead. If you receive communion on June 7, with the complete practice you have learned, and you keep receiving communion this way, Sunday after Sunday for the months that follow, what will happen in your life is not going to be noticed at the end of Corpus Christi. It will be noticed in September. It will be noticed in December. It will be noticed next year when the next Corpus Christi arrives and you look back and discover, with a mix of astonishment and silence, that you are not the same person who began this practice a year before. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes several concrete changes she promised her spiritual daughters if they sustained well-received communion for the necessary length of time. The first, patience with trials. The soul that receives communion this way develops a capacity to bear what before would break it completely. The trials do not vanish, but inside there is something else holding it up. Christ has been settled in the center, communion after communion, and from that center comes a strength the soul did not know it had. The second, the sense of God's presence outside of Mass. Souls who persevere in this practice, according to Saint Teresa of Avila, begin to sense God's presence throughout the day, not as a vision, not as a mystical phenomenon, as a companionship, a silent, steady companionship that changes the tone of ordinary hours. The shopping, the cooking, the work, the conversation with the children, all of it is done in the presence of someone who is inside the chest. The third, prayer becomes thirst. What was once obligation or habit turns into something the soul seeks on its own. You no longer have to work at making time for prayer. The time finds itself because the soul misses those minutes with Christ. That change, in her view, is one of the clearest fruits of Eucharistic practice sustained over time. And the fourth, the hardest to describe and also the most important of all. The soul stops being afraid, not afraid of specific things which may remain a little, but the deep fear, the one that lies under all the others, the fear of life itself, of death, of the ultimate meaning of things. That fear dissolves little by little, as if Christ, present in the center of the castle, had been pushing it outward without the soul ever noticing. That is the promise of Saint Teresa of Jesus, and it is fulfilled. Not in everyone who receives communion, only in those who receive communion this way. June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, is the concrete opportunity to begin, because that day carries a liturgical weight that multiplies the effect of the first step. What is sown on June 7th of this year can become, if kept over time, the beginning of a transformation that lasts the rest of your life. And that, said with the sobriety with which Saint Teresa of Avila wrote her treatises, is not a pretty metaphor. It is a concrete promise, recorded in writing, sustained by 20 centuries of Catholic tradition, and verified by thousands of souls who have lived it through the ages. Here ends what you have been listening to. But what Corpus Christi offers you does not end here, not by a long stretch. What you have heard is only the beginning. What follows depends on you, on your faithfulness, on your perseverance. If you have made it this far, you have done something very few people do on an ordinary day. You have sat in silence while a woman from the 16th century explained to you the most intimate secret of the Catholic faith. You have let yourself be led into the choir of a Castilian convent. You have seen Saint Teresa of Jesus kneeling on the stone floor, watching her sisters recording with the eyes of the soul what she saw. And you have been placed in your hands a complete practice, step by step, that fits into a single Mass, and that can change the rest of your communions. This is not a small thing. This is a great deal. Stay a moment longer with what you have just received. What you carry now is a key, a concrete key for June 7, 3 minutes before. You are here in the exact second. 15 minutes after, divided into stillness, conversation, and letting yourself be looked at. The first discalced Carmelites in Castile had this key. The Mother Foundress had it. Those who receive communion this way have it. And now you have it too. If this evening in your room you remember something of what you have heard, that something is seed. If on Sunday, June 7th, in your pew, you try to apply just one of the 3 steps, that step is a beginning. And if a year from now you look back and find that you are still doing it, that habit is what Saint Teresa of Avila called the beginning of the true path. What has happened in these minutes between your heart and hers is a conversation that was worth having. And now, before you go back to your tasks, before the day swallows up this voice that has been with you, it is worth holding on to one more thing. Because what Saint Teresa of Jesus left in writing about communion is only one piece of a much larger mosaic. She spent 40 years of religious life observing how the human soul relates to God in all its layers. And she recorded things that almost no one tells in these terms anymore. Things about what happens in the soul of the departed in the first days after death. Things about Christ's visits to the souls who are alone in their homes, praying in silence with no one beside them. Things about the concrete signs that a soul in purgatory is asking for prayers. Things about the gaze of the Virgin Mary upon souls who carry old burdens of guilt no confessor has ever fully untied. There are many souls who spend their whole lives believing these truths will never be revealed to them, and they die holding that conviction. But those truths exist. They are written down. They have been held by Catholic doctrine for centuries. And they only need a voice that brings them from the old books to the ear of the devout believer of today. That is what we try to do here every week. To gather what Saint Teresa of Avila and other authentic Catholic mystics left in writing, and to put it into words your heart can receive without academic filters, without cold language, without unnecessary distance. There is something worth knowing, something worth remembering in the days ahead. The path you have opened this evening does not end here. Every step you take inward opens a door that shows you another door behind it. The communion practice you have learned is only the first threshold. Behind it are the practices for silent prayer in your room, the practices for the anniversaries of your departed, the practices for the days when the cross weighs too heavy and you do not know whom to ask for help. Saint Teresa of Jesus left concrete answers for every one of those moments. Answers that are not published in the prayer manuals sold in any bookshop. Answers that come from her direct experience, from her daily dealings with Christ, from the 40 years in which she herself was tested and found the way to stand firm. And every one of those answers is waiting for you, not to overwhelm you, not to add burdens to the ones you already carry, to keep you company, to make you feel you are not alone on this path, so that your faith stops being a string of isolated obligations and becomes what Saint Teresa of Avila lived, a continuous conversation, alive, sustained, with Christ inside your own chest throughout the day. There is a next step, and that step is waiting for you right now, just after these last words. A voice, a truth, one more piece of the mosaic your soul has been searching for without quite knowing how to name it. If you stay, you will find it. If you leave, that truth will still be there tomorrow. But today is the day your heart is open. Today is the day the seed of Corpus Christi has been planted, and fresh seeds grow faster than those sown at any other time. Your soul knows what it needs to hear next. Let it lead you. before I say goodbye, one last thing. You take with you a gift no one can ever take back: the knowing. On June 7th, the day of Corpus Christi, you will know something very few Catholics in the world will know that day. And that knowing, even if it remains silent, even if you tell no one, will change the way you kneel in your pew. May the peace of Christ stay with you this evening. May His Mother, the Virgin Mary, cover you with her mantle in the steps that lie ahead. May Saint Teresa of Jesus, who now looks upon you from eternity, be for you a silent companion in prayer on the difficult days. And may this year's Corpus Christi be, in your life, the beginning of something that only you and Christ will fully understand, in the secret of the interior castle you carry within you. Until soon, sister. Until soon, brother. May God keep you.